Imagine if language, human language, had only existed for 24 hours. If human language had only existed for 24 hours, then writing would have been invented around 11:10 p.m. So that's how late writing comes in terms of human language. Language is, in essence, spoken. And even today, the vast majority of the world's languages are not written in any real way. There are only about 200 languages where there's really what you would call a literature and speakers are used to seeing them on the page. Otherwise, somebody may have done a Bible translation, maybe there's some stories, maybe there's some signs or something like that. But for the most part, it's an oral language, it's spoken, and people are bemused to see it on the page. And so this means that writing is derived. You can call it marked even. Writing is the secondary kind of expression of language. The real one is speaking. And an analogy would be dance notation. You know, there are ways of notating dances. You can do a Balanchine dance, even though he's not here to tell us how to do it, sometimes from one of his old grand ballerinas, but these things have been or are being written down so that you can take what's on the page and dance from it. But none of us are under the impression that dance notation is dance. We know that that's just something on paper, not quite alive, a little bit artificial. The real thing is dancing. In the same way, writing is not language. It's a representation on the page of language. And as such, it's actually not surprising that it took a while for it to emerge. For most of the existence of human language, all one did was what I'm doing. You just spoke. And there's no such thing as scratching representations of it onto flat surfaces and passing them around. There was no need, and that didn't happen. And as a result, the first known writing system for us comes along around 3500 BC in what is today Iraq and Iran. And the kind of writing that it is called cuneiform, and it's pressed into clay. So you can see an example of that here. Quite pretty, isn't it? That is cuneiform. And as far as how that started, what we know is that there have been found little clay tokens that seem to signify various things. And there's a correspondence between a lot of the little clay tokens that you could hold in your hand and early cuneiform writing. And so it seems that the original idea was here we have these clay tokens which stand for things, which can count things or symbolize what should be inside of a container or something like that. Then someone had the idea of etching a representation of those little clay tokens into clay rather than actually having to handle them themselves. Those clay tokens were found, for example, in Susa in Iran. That's one of the former capitals of a sort of old Persia. Language change. Susa is now called Shush, and so we have a shift from the alveolar to the alveopalatal. So that is how it seems to have begun. In the early cuneiform writing, what we see is literal pictures of things. As you can imagine, if you were trying to come up with a way of writing, if you can put yourself into the head of somebody who's trying to come up with a way of writing for the very, very, very first time in human history that we know of. And so very gradually, these representations evolve into abstract symbols for things that you wouldn't know what they were if you weren't told. And so, for example, the symbol for bird, you see its development from early to later cuneiform. And the first sign, it's quite clear that that's a bird. But then there are various distortions where after a while what you've got is a kind of glyph for a bird. That happened over time. Or in the same way, there was an original sign for woman, and it developed in this same abstract way. And so what you got was, on paper, a development of abstract signifiers for signifieds. And so it's not completely arbitrary for a drawing of a graceful flying thing to correspond to a bird. But it is quite abstract when it becomes something that you wouldn't know what it was unless you were told. And so that happened. And what also happened that mirrored the kind of thing that happens in spoken language change is that the literal symbols, which are called pictographic, often developed into abstract ones, and those are called ideographic, i.e. about ideas. And so, for example, the symbol for head evolved into an abstract symbol, and the abstract symbol meant front as well as head. And so you had that same development from the concrete to the abstract that we've seen in grammaticalization in the development of cuneiform. So you can see how the head is here, the head changes its orientation. And so pretty soon, not only do you have a different kind of symbol, but it has a grammaticalized meaning in terms of front or in front of in particular. Now, what I have left out so far in terms of cuneiform is what language was this? I mean, I think we can guess that it wasn't English because we were not in England. However, we do know what this language was. It was a language called Sumerian. And Sumerian is a language with no known relatives, but we have a pretty good idea of what it was like because of these cuneiform representations. And cuneiform was later used to write many other languages in the area, such as Akkadian, which was the leading Semitic language of its time, Semitic having Arabic and Hebrew in it, and later even Hittite, which was an early Indo-European language. But at first, it is the writing system for the now extinct language called Sumerian. And in Sumerian, the word for arrow was she. And so there was a symbol for that, and you can see the relationship with arrow. Now, something started happening. The word for life also happened to be she. So there's situations like that in all languages. And so the symbol that had originally been used just for arrow started being used for life as well. And then the next mental step was to think that whenever the syllable she occurs within a word, that you might use this symbol here, originally only meaning life, but then coming to mean, originally only meaning arrow, then coming to mean life, then coming to mean the sequence of sounds she. And so you had a situation where at first people were just drawing pictures of things, as you might imagine a child doing or somebody doing when they first develop a writing system. But then we have a new development where people start to see more abstract relationships between what they're putting on paper and the language that is actually spoken. And in cuneiform, this is about as far as it went, but more happened in the world of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics, in terms of the factoid, were long assumed to have developed about 5 centuries after cuneiform, but there was a discovery in 1998 that suggests that hieroglyphics and cuneiforms may have developed around the same time. There's certainly no reason that they would not have. And so it used to be that cuneiforms were always discussed first because they were first. They may not have been. But in any case, I'm adhering to tradition by starting with them. But hieroglyphics were a different system. And hieroglyphics, despite the fact that they were used in Egypt, were not used to write Arabic because Arabic had not spread to Egypt yet with the spreading of Islam. That was something that happened after 600 AD. At this point, the language spoken in Egypt was called Coptic. And I'm calling Semitic a family, but actually Semitic is a subfamily within an actual family called Afro-Asiatic. Coptic is one of the other branches. And so that was the language that hieroglyphics were being used to write. And we had the same kind of situation where you had pictograms being used as ideograms. And so here we can see the pictogram for hand, and it's quite obvious why that's a hand, because it's a picture of a hand. And then that also came to mean power. And so that's a more abstract meaning and an abstract representation as well. So this is the sort of thing that happened both in cuneiform and in hieroglyphics. It seems to be natural to process writing systems that way over time. And then pictograms were also used in hieroglyphics to indicate syllables, just like we saw with the she in Sumerian. And then also consonants, just consonants alone. And so here you see the symbol for mouth, which is ro. And after a while, it also came to stand for just the R sound, as we might think. But not everybody thought that as immediately as we would. As we might think, they did that. Now, what's interesting is that really, you would think at this point that the people using this system would realize that if rho can mean just R, then why don't we make all of this simpler and start having a symbol correspond to a sound? They didn't do that. And it's interesting how that kind of thing can happen throughout history, that we can look back and see people just on the verge of what would seem to be an obvious solution or an obvious development, and somehow it doesn't happen, it doesn't occur to them as quickly as we might think. Like in one of the weirdest things about early talkies, talking about like from 1927 to early 33, is that they're all, despite the fact that they're talkies, they're strangely silent movies in some ways, because you're not allowed to play music in the background. There was a sense that even though in silent films were never silent, you had at least somebody banging on the piano and maybe a orchestra, swelling underneath. And the idea was that there was this abstract music playing while people are walking down the street. But once you were in the world of the talkies, there was a sense that it would be unnatural to have background music. And so people are kind of walking around and you can kind of hear their shoes clopping and their dresses kind of swishing, but there's no music to cover any of this up. And if they want some music, then somebody will say, well, let's turn on the radio, and they'll go click, and then this music comes on. But it has to be actual music. There's no such thing as just walking down the street with music. And you're thinking, if you guys were having music in your silent movies 10 minutes ago, why don't you have those same orchestras playing music now like in our movies, and it enhances our movies so much? Well, they could have, but it just didn't occur to them. In the same way, in hieroglyphics, they could transcribe consonants, but we think so, therefore it's alphabet time, folks, but not to them. They like things the way they were. So, for example, it was kind of ingenious in its way. Here is a branch. And so there's this branch thing here. And then underneath it is the symbols Underneath it, let's be prescriptive. Underneath it are the symbols for H and T. Now, the word, if that's how it sounded, we can only guess, that meant wood. Now, it also happened to mean retreat in Coptic. And so the way that they handled it was that you could have this branch plus this H and this T, and if you put a knife next to it, then it meant carve. And if you put a pair of these boots are made for walking legs next to it, then you could indicate retreat. And so all of that is very clever. A little clumsy, frankly. This was an elite activity. This was not the sort of thing that was taught to what was considered the masses. There was a class of scribes who were taught very carefully how to do this. This was not a very democratic writing system, but they had it. Now, as time went by, as you can imagine human beings would do, we've all seen hieroglyphics, and they're pretty elaborate. And if the occasion arises that you want to write something faster than what would be involved in scribing something on the side of some obelisk or something like that, maybe there's going to be some sort of shorthand. And there was something called the hieratic script. And this was when you were writing hieroglyphics in ink on papyrus. And this was for everyday use. And you can see that these are simplified hieroglyphics. And so that is the hieratic script. Now, it's interesting. What does all this stuff say? Like, we certainly can't tell. It looks like a bunch of very pretty pictures with people holding their arms in peculiar ways, and their cats and things. Now, how do we figure out what this means? And it was quite a challenge. It used to be, people were long aware that there was this writing in the remains of ancient Egypt, but it was thought that it must just be a bunch of pictures. And that was not such an unreasonable thing to think. It was thought that people were kind of drawing pictures of stuff that happened, and it all made sense to them because they already knew what happened. And then we were kind of left with the challenge of figuring out what all these pictures were saying. And then there was also the sense, which still reigns with us today to an extent, that people in the past were somehow more simple-minded. And so it was assumed that there wasn't any kind of actual transcription of language going on. It was only when the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 that there started to be an idea that there might be something more going on, and that one could try to do a decipherment if one thought there was any deciphering to be done, and have some sort of intelligent and useful evidence to work with. And the Rosetta Stone had the same text in Greek, and there was no problem figuring out what that meant, and then in hieroglyphic and hieratic. And so this gave you an opportunity to, because it's clear when you see the Rosetta Stone, as you're seeing it now, you get the feeling that it's the same text in those three kinds of writing. So this gives you an opportunity to figure out what the hieroglyphics and the corresponding hieratics might be saying. But imagine what the challenge of that would be. Like you've got these things there, but you don't know the writing system. So imagine, for example, if nobody knew Russian and nobody knew the Cyrillic alphabet. And so here you've got, I like 5 newspapers, and then underneath it is what you see here. Now that's the Russian for it. Now, as it happens, here's another screen. Here I can show you that what that says is 5 newspapers to me please themselves. More specifically, it's 5 of newspapers. Remember that crazy thing from the de Saussure lecture where the genitive plural has no marker? This is that in use to make it seem less abstract. So 5 of newspapers, and then the way that you say I like is to me please themselves. And so Piat Gazette mnie nравится. Now that's the way it works. Now how are you going to figure out, to go back to the first screen of this, how are you going to figure out what's going on linguistically when you can't decode this alphabet and you don't know any Russian? Well, the way this ended up working was rather interesting. And it helped that there was a knowledge of Coptic. So they did have a certain leg up. But figuring out what the correspondence was between that and this writing system was hardly easy. And what happened was begun by Thomas Young. And Thomas Young was a physicist and a physician. As one of these polymaths, in this time when it was easier to know everything, this man didn't just know one kind of Aramaic. He knew 2 kinds of Aramaic. And he knew a whole bunch of other languages. He apparently discovered the fact that our ocular perception is a matter of the combination of 3 basic colors. He identified various diseases, and he took it upon himself to figure out what was going with the Rosetta Stone. And he noticed that there were these what's called cartouches. And the cartouches are that there are certain words in hieroglyphics that are encased in these pretty little things that look kind of like St. Joseph's aspirin on a pedestal. And so that was there. And looking at Greek, where, say, for example, Ptolemy's name appeared, and then looking at the hieroglyphics in the cartouches, he made the guess that what's in the cartouches must correspond, for example, to the names of these Greek figures. And so he looked at, for example, this one, and he figured out that this was actually indicating Ptolemy. And he figured it out phonetically. He could see which sounds corresponded, and that seemed to work for Greek names. But Thomas Young, and he was a brilliant man, but he stopped there. He assumed that the cartouches were the only places where there was any kind of transcription of language. He thought all the rest was still just kind of random pictures, and he figured that this was the way that they managed the challenge of writing a foreign name. And so it was kind of like the way talkies were. In 32 and 33, some of them were moving along. And so you have this movie where there's, for our standard, mysteriously little music. And you have people turning on the radio. And, for some reason, nobody does any announcing on the radio. It's just this music, but you have to at least pretend. Then at one point in, for example, Dinner at 8, that's my favorite old movie. That's 1933. Millicent Jordan is having a party, and she has a string orchestra. And so she says, well, play, boys. That's Billy Burke. And so they start playing. And kind of mysteriously, for the next 15 minutes of the movie, the string orchestra's songs always precisely parallel the emotional tone of whatever scene is going on. So somehow they know the conversations people are having in every room. So they're almost to the point where they realize that a movie is supposed to have music, but still it has to be literal. So Thomas Young was like the Dinner at 8. And he just let it go. Then we come to the prodigy. And that's the person who actually figured this out. And that is Jean-François Champollion. And he noticed something crucial. He noticed that there were cartouches in hieroglyphic writing that came from before Greco-Roman contact. So before the Egyptians had contact with the people across the pond, there were still cartouches. So that meant that it couldn't be just that the cartouches were translations of names like Ptolemy. And so one of those cartouches was this one. And so you can see this here. And this Champollion was one of these people. He also had taken it upon himself to master two varieties of Aramaic. And he had the Latin, he had the Greek, he had some Chinese, Persian, Sanskrit, you name it. And that included Coptic. And so he took a look at this thing, and Thomas Young had already figured out that the two final syllables stood for S. He got that. And Champollion knew Coptic, and he figured, well, the leftmost symbol, because it looks like a sun, and you can see that here. Well, in Coptic, sun is Ra, and so this must be Ra. And so he knew, okay, this must be Ra, S. And then he thought, well, who would that be? You know, what Egyptian figure would it be where you'd have Ra, S. And he thought, oh, wait a minute, Ramesses. And so Ra-me-sis. And so by deducing, he could figure out what the rest of the cartouche was saying. And this meant something very important. It meant that there wasn't just some cute little code that they were using in cartouches to transcribe names of famous people from across the pond. It was actually a system that was in use for the entire writing system. So this meant that he had cracked the key. All of hieroglyphics were written in this rebus-like kind of patterning where you have this combination of pictorial representations and then syllabic representations and then single consonant sounds. He cracked it. He fainted, incidentally. He fainted a lot. He was made a professor at 17. When he got the news, he fell down on the floor. When he first began to discover that there was something going on other than just big names from across the pond, he fainted and was in bed for days. And when he cracked it, he fainted again. Very delicate man, brilliant people tend to be. In any case, this was the beginning of truly understanding hieroglyphics. And poor Jean-Francois died at 41, but people continued after him. And now we know what those hieroglyphics said. But in terms of a writing system, if we're going to be a little ethnocentric, and let's harmlessly be a little ethnocentric for a bit, what about alphabet? When did what we think of as real writing come along? And of course, that's not fair because there are thriving writing systems that are not alphabetic in this world, such as the Chinese and Japanese one. But when did ours come along? You know, we have a right to have some sort of self-interest. And that is a continuation of this story. The Egyptians had their hieratic script. Now, another group in this story is the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were Semitic language speakers, so we're in that family that is Arabic and Hebrew and also Akkadian, the dead one. And the Phoenicians are down southerly and southeasterly across the pond from Greece and Rome. And they invented their alphabet around 900 BC, maybe a couple centuries earlier. And they derived it partly from Egyptians' hieratic script. What they did is they translated the meaning of a symbol in Egyptian into Phoenician, and then they made that symbol stand for the first letter in that word. This was a massive revolution because that's the beginning of getting towards what we call writing. And so you can see that happening here on the screen. This was a big idea. And as far as we know, the idea of having symbols stand for the first letter of what they represented started as some kind of shorthand when there was a need for more writing in Egypt's growing army. Egypt had a growing army, but they did not take the ball and run with it. For Egypt, it was just kind of an eccentricity, something that you do on the fly. For the Phoenicians, they figured out, why don't we just have it be this way all the time? Now, the Phoenicians did not indicate in their system vowels. For them, they just used consonants. And there's a certain sense in that. It's perfectly legible that way. And so for them, aleph, which we take to mean A, actually indicated a glottal stop. For them, was a real sound. And so that's what it originally indicated. And that kind of alphabet still works. Hebrew is partly that way. Like if we look on the screen now at some modern Israeli Hebrew, then we have that's each letter that you bring to us. And just look at the first two words. And so b'kol michtav. Now, the kol that I'm saying is not indicated here. What the first word says is and you just have to know what the vowels are. The second word is and one just has to know that it's michtav. Those aren't indicated. Now, you can indicate the vowels in various ways in this script. However, all of it is very much abbreviated compared to what we are used to. And that is something which originally began when the Phoenicians created the first writing system where you had any kind of correspondence in a regular and universal way between symbols and sounds. Now, the Phoenicians passed this system along to the Greeks, and the Greeks adopted some of the signs to indicate vowels. And so you can see that how in Greek, Phoenicians' daleth, which was a door, became Greek's delta. And so here is where a true alphabet begins. So this is the King Kong, the movie. King Kong was one of the first movies where they gave up the idea that the music is coming from a string orchestra or a radio, and they just played some darn music and saw that it really enhanced things. If they're in the jungle and there's this big rubber model of an ape chasing after you, where's the music going to be coming from? You know, there's nowhere to plug in a radio, and they certainly didn't bring a string orchestra. So they had to just give in, and that helped them to get the idea. And next thing you know, by the mid-30s, they're actually playing some music in the movies. The Greeks were the equivalent. And daleth has had a fate in various alphabets, and that's because the Phoenician alphabet traveled much further than Greece. It was the foundation of the writing systems now used for not only Hebrew, but Arabic and languages as far afield from its origins as India and Southeast Asia and even Mongolia. It all starts with the Phoenicians. And the reason that Phoenicians' writing system spread so fast is connected partly to the fact that it was relatively easy to learn. Learning how to scribe cuneiforms and hieroglyphics must have been a glorious nightmare, just as learning the Chinese writing system is today. No disrespect intended, but that's one knuckle-cracking way of writing. Whereas if you're just dealing with correspondence to sounds, well, there is no language that has hundreds of thousands of sounds. And so you have a much easier system. And the Phoenicians were incredible travelers. They traveled throughout the Mediterranean, and there's evidence of them as far up northwest as Ireland. And if you get a kick out of who'da thunk it theories, there was recently discovered in some silt way up as far as Denmark shards of Phoenician pottery. Now, we don't know yet whether the Phoenicians actually traveled all the way up that way, but it would not be utterly impossible in terms of folkloristic sources and in terms of their technology. It's been shown that with the technology available at the time, there were people who did sail equivalent distances and dealt with worse meteorological conditions. So maybe the Phoenicians got up there, but they definitely traveled far and wide. And so that strengthened their influence. If anybody's writing system was going to take fire, it was likely to be theirs. In any case, having an alphabet at last was part of democratization in many areas. It helped to open up writing to a larger class of people instead of it being a matter of a small scribal class transcribing for the purposes of business and for royal affairs. It's possible that if the only kind of writing system we still had was like hieroglyphics, such as the Chinese writing system, then developments in the world may have been different in terms of the development of a middle class, in terms of the spread of literacy. So it was very important what the Phoenicians and the Greeks did. And in addition, it's only when there's a writing system and widespread literacy that a stage of the language is preserved on paper forever. And then as time goes on, people start comparing what's written with the way people talk and start having feelings about how language change is inappropriate because there's a real form of the language. The sense that there's a real form of the language that's always just out of reach comes mostly from there being language down on the page. Small indigenous groups have little spats about what form is the right one to use, but not nearly as much as people in societies where there is widespread literacy in a language and centuries worth of representations of that language. So not only did the development of an alphabet have major social repercussions in the development of many countries in the world, but it had a lot to do with the development of the battle between descriptivists and prescriptivists that we discussed in the previous lectures.